for our fourth and final panel of the day on public perceptions, legitimacy, and process in speech moderation. We have another fantastic panel. Eileen Nielsen is with us from ETH Zurich, who is the author of a paper in our special issue on that issue, on that theme. Eugene Volokh is professor of law here at the UCLA School of Law. And Erin is professor of law at the USC Gould School of Law. So I want to kick things off just by allowing Eileen, giving Eileen a few minutes to kind of introduce her paper, introduce her research, and then we can follow up with our two other panelists to sort of ask, starting with kind of broad questions about the purpose and legitimacy of restrictions on speech in a democratic society, and then we can maybe drill a little bit deeper into the specific themes that are raised both by the paper and by the issue more generally. So, Eileen, over to you if you want to kick things off.
Oh, sure.
I don't know what
Here we go.
is happy to do it or not. Okay. Hello, everybody. I want to thank you especially for being here at the end of a very interesting but also long day. So I appreciate you sticking with us for the last panel. I also want to especially thank Lisa and Maddie and all the editors at UCLA Jolt. It was really a pleasure to work with them, and I feel privileged to be part of this. I would also like to thank Michael and Alexandra for all the political things and making us comfortable here in LA. So I am a law and text scholar who tries to look at questions from either an empirical or an experimental basis. So to me, it's interesting to think, how do people think about these things? How do they judge them? How do they interact with new technologies or with legal problems that come up in response to technology? So my motivation for this paper was partly, this is obviously a topic of great interest, right? As more and more of our speech moves onto private platforms, privately owned, privately maintained platforms. What does that mean? How do people think about it? And there are sort of two observations, at least to me, that seem important. One is that if you look at scholarship or just listening to podcasts on things like this, for the most part, you hear a lot about sort of legal dogma. You hear a lot about what big tech companies think or want. You hear the same names again and again of people with very high net worths and a lot of power, and obviously they're relevant. But I also think what ordinary people think is relevant, and that if it isn't, we have some problems that should be addressed one way or another. And of course, there's many ways to do that. I don't have the answer to that, but we should at least know what people think and whether that seems to be reflected in policy in any way. So that was sort of one observation. The conversation we're having, for the most part, is very high level individuals thinking about these things. Another motivation was noticing, not a very original observation, that certain politicians really seems to be displaying constitutionalized rhetoric about certain topics unnecessarily, misleadingly. I think we're all sort of used to that idea. They've been called out on this. But I also wanted to think, well, why are they doing this? Is there some return to them on this behavior? Do they know what it is? What is it anyway? If I run an experiment, can I get some insights into the potential effects of these misrepresentations? So with that in mind, I studied the scenario with an online survey looking at, if I ask people what is possibly a very basic constitutional question, do they get it right or wrong? I suspect I might get roasted. Like one of my peers with two constitutional scholars, and I won't get roasted on this point, fair enough. But like these sort of basic questions that we use to teach high school students, do they sort of get it right or wrong in this binary sense? Does this question about the Constitution, and specifically about the First Amendment, tend to be predictive about their judgments about content moderation? It shouldn't necessarily logically have to be connected, but is it empirically? Is it true that in sort of the popular imagination, these concepts are all mixed up together in a way where your behavior and opinions about A also predict your behavior or opinions about B? And if so, is it possible that there is some way to maybe message about A and produce a response about B? So A is sort of your constitutional knowledge, B is your feelings about a private platform doing some form of content moderation. So if there is a connection, is it also possible to use that connection in the way that maybe advocates of content moderation might want? So to the extent that they encounter resistance, and that resistance might have something to do with people feeling that it's some kind of constitutional violation, say when Facebook takes down your message. Is it true? Is it possible that if you educate them about at least traditional black letter law in this area and explain, well, this might not be a constitutional issue, it might just be a matter of policy. Would it be less emotional, less offensive to people when they don't anymore think of it as some infringement on their constitutional rights? They're just sort of viewing this under private law as a matter of agreement between parties. So briefly, my experimental findings were threefold. So first, I verified what I already showed has been found in other surveys, is that people seem to have this sort of systematically overly broad understanding of constitutional protections on their speech. They sort of expect many things to be constitutionally protected that are not, in fact, constitutionally protected. Number two, that this did, in fact, tend to predict their attitudes about content moderation. So if they systematically got that these constitutional questions right or wrong, tended to predict whether they had greater or lesser support for a content moderation decision. But then finally, there was this interesting effect that I wasn't expecting, which was a backfire effect. So first I said, okay, there is a sort of systematic misunderstanding. Secondly, the systematic misunderstanding about constitutional matters seems to translate into certain attitudes one way or the other about content moderation. And so the third question would be, well then, to the extent you want to moderate people's attitudes about content moderation, can you do it through constitutional education? And the answer is, it doesn't turn out the way you would expect. The answer is, if you give people a sort of short intervention explaining that their First Amendment rights are not usually going to be valid against a private party in terms of speech restrictions, that in fact makes them less supportive of content moderation. So when you try to tell them, actually this is not necessarily a matter of your constitutional right being infringed, for a specific portion of the population, it weighs down by politics, as it turns out, not for Democrats, but for Republicans, they become less supportive of content moderation. So for Democrats, they don't care. There's no effect one way or the other with this educational intervention. With Republicans, you have a backfire effect, where the thing you might have tried to do with education is in fact the opposite. You are trying perhaps to increase support for content moderation, it actually goes down. So I think this research shows a few important things. Number one, we need to look more into the actual empirical and experimental facts about what happens when you give people legal information that may or may not be achieving what you hope to achieve. So for example, many private advocacy organizations, nonprofits, tend to use education as a strategy. I'm not aware of many of them systematically and with randomized trials actually seeing whether the effects of their training are what they expect to be, number one. And number two, perhaps we should take misrepresentations that we see about the law more seriously in terms of whether they are either taking hold and miseducating the public, which is worrying, or whether they are examples of people sort of strategically using existing misperceptions, which is also concerning. So I will leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks. So why don't we move to the right and then to the right? The question that I had written was to allow each of you to plant an initial plan about your thoughts on the purpose and legitimacy of restrictions on speech in a democratic society. I know both of you are going to have very interesting thoughts on that, but I also want to give you a chance if you prefer just to respond directly or to comment while it's fresh.
Right.
I also don't want to preclude that.
I think this is an excellent launching off point. And actually, your point about restrictions on speech is also an excellent launching. But let me approach it from a somewhat different direction. So my undergrad degree from this very institution, class of 1983, math, computer science. I was supposed to be a mathematician. And I still have my little mathematical crotches. For example, whenever my students write a number of something, my first reaction is, I don't like that. 0 is a number, 1's a number. What does it mean, a number of something? That's meaningless. Of course, I realize it's a crotch. I still don't use it in my briefs. I prefer something even vague, like several or a few. But I realize when people say a number, it means something more than 0 or 1, or like to the nth degree. I still don't like it. I still never use it. But you say, well, wait, 0th degree? Well, that's something to the 0th power. That's just 1, right? What kind of degree is it? I realize that what I'm trying to do there, and I'm entitled to do it in my own writing, is to impose my vision of kind of mathematical definitions on top of other people's imprecise use. Use it so precise in part because they're not constitutional. To approach the problem one step closer, then I'll get to the actual issue. Imagine somebody hears about some department store ejecting somebody because that person is black. And their reaction might be, that's unconstitutional. That's a violation of the Equal Protection Clause. No, we lawyers know that's not right, because the Equal Protection Clause does not apply to private entities. And while you can gin up some state action theories as to why a large business is a corporation is a state actor, it doesn't work. We know that it's not right. But maybe what they mean is not necessarily Equal Protection Clause. They're not lawyers. Their job isn't to think about it, to parse the world the way we parse it. It might mean, you know what, it's like, aren't there laws that ban that? And of course, there are public accommodation laws. It turns out, people don't notice, the federal public accommodation law, Title VII, applies to very narrow range of businesses. It doesn't apply to retailers. So there's actually no violation of a federal law at someone discriminating. Just even putting up signs saying, we do not serve blacks here, we do not serve whites, we don't serve Jews, or whatever it is. Most states, however, have such laws, and I suppose somebody could say, well, even if the state doesn't have such law, they should. Because what I said, when I said Equal Protection Clause, what I really meant is broader racial equality or broader equality principles. And yeah, we mix this up, even law professors sometimes mix this up. Sometimes they say First Amendment when they're talking about state constitutional provisions, whether they are federal or state constitutional provisions, where it's not the First Amendment, it's Article 1, Section 7 or something. But it's shorthand, it's imprecise, but we use it. Sometimes you might have somebody talk about free exercise challenge where it's actually a challenge in the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which is meant to implement free exercise norms as they were in the 70s and 80s, but it's technically not free exercise. Well, it's technically. So what I wonder might be happening is people out there who are not lawyers, whose job isn't to remember what's Equal Protection Clause or not, or First Amendment or not. They use First Amendment as shorthand for, and this is what Michael was referring to, free speech principles. So what they mean isn't necessarily that what Twitter is doing in banning real Donald Trump, or what Twitter is doing in banning the Babylon Bee, responding to Time naming Rachel Levine, who's a transgender admiral, the Woman of the Year. Babylon Bee responded calling Rachel Levine the Man of the Year, because their view is that transgender identifying as female doesn't make you female. That's the Babylon Bee's view. Time's view is obviously opposite. Twitter is on Time's side. Twitter blocks the Babylon Bee account. People, it's true they're wrong from a lawyer's perspective in saying there's a First Amendment issue. Maybe what they're really getting at is there's a basic free speech principle that ought to be reflected in law. They're not saying what Twitter did is actually illegal, and I'm surprised that nobody sued them. I don't think that's what they're saying. They're saying it ought to. So then, of course, there are a couple of interesting questions. One is, if you want to try to persuade them that more Twitter moderation is better, what do you do? How do you persuade them that their view of what ought to be the law is wrong? One possibility is to say, well, it's not the law. But then I said, okay, so much the worse for the law. Another possibility is to say it's really very valuable to democracy that Twitter be able to block evil ideas, including ideas about gender identity, for example, that are probably shared, if not by a majority of the American population, at least a very substantial portion of the American population. Maybe it's a good idea for Twitter to release. Maybe you might draw the analogy to newspapers, right? Historically, a newspaper has had every right to decide what to publish and what not to publish. And probably good that newspapers were thinking about this. Though on the other hand, it's not like Twitter and Facebook really position themselves as newspapers. And in fact, they have certain legal immunities that stem from their identifying themselves not as newspapers. So another possibility is you might say, well, no, we do believe that Twitter and Facebook should respect free speech principles. But free speech principles are actually narrower than we think. Maybe, in fact, American law should allow suppression of anti-transgender messages or suppression of real Donald Trump's or President Trump's messages. Or perhaps American law shouldn't allow outright suppression, but maybe the free speech principle should apply differently to the government than it does to private entities. And that maybe, for example, you shouldn't go to jail for expressing certain views views about transgender identity, but in fact, you should be banned from polite company or banned from Twitter. So those are interesting questions, but I think they're a little bit more complicated than just asking, well, what does the First Amendment mean, and are people right about it? Let me close with one analogy. One thing that I have to come back to is the McCarthy era. So if you think back on the 1950s in America, the way that communist and near communist and supposedly communist advocacy was treated, there was actually a mixed things. A very few people were actually prosecuted. That's the famous Dennis case, scales. You know, some of those convictions were affirmed, some were reversed. Very, very few. It's just basically the top, some of the top. There was also, of course, governmental exposure, investigation, use of coercive powers. And today, people don't seem to need as much because we leave so many more tracks, perhaps foolishly, on social media and other things. But also there was private entities. For example, the Hollywood blacklist. By definition, it's Hollywood, right? It's movie studios that decided we're not going to hire people who are communists, which could just mean they were once communists, they were once friendly with communists, or refused to denounce communists, or are communist sympathizers or fellow travelers, or in this expanding zone. Partly because maybe the Hollywood people said, you know, we're capitalists. They're trying to destroy the very system that we profit from. Why should we pay them for it? Alternatively, they might have said, as in fact there was a lot of social pressure, saying, you know, we don't really want to suppress their views, but we don't also don't want to be boycotted by anti-communists. So we are going to take this step because that's what our public demands. So one question is, what do you think? Well, obviously not a First Amendment violation. Might be actually a violation of state law. California has long had a law that bans employers from basically firing people for political affiliation. Might be also a violation of broader free speech principles. Or maybe not. Maybe you'd say, again, free speech, you know, you shouldn't criminalize communist advocacy, but certainly if people want to boycott communists, you totally understand that, of course, employers shouldn't have to employ such people, especially in places where they may be in a position to influence public attitudes. But that's what we should be thinking about. And I think the answer is, well, the First Amendment doesn't apply to Hollywood, doesn't fully answer the question of what we should think about Hollywood.
So, Erin.
Right.
Oh, yes, I'm sorry.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Michael, and everyone at UCLA, Joel, and Alexandra for just rescuing me in the parking structure. I'm really pleased to be here. And I thought maybe what I would do is just start off by explaining, first of all, that I'm a free speech theorist. So I tend to focus not just on what the First Amendment doctrine says, but also on what First Amendment doctrine ought to be. And so reading Eileen's work was really interesting, and thinking about how citizens are thinking about what the law is and then maybe what it ought to be. And I find that I have some sympathies maybe with what citizens think that the First Amendment ought to be, maybe what it could be if it's stretched a little bit. So let me talk about two features of social media companies, because that's kind of our theme for today largely, that I think raise this question of whether or not they are acting in certain respects like states do, and what that can mean for them. So the first feature of what the big social media companies are doing that I've been thinking about a lot lately, and by big social media companies, I mean Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, is that I think, and this is something I think that citizens are kind of picking up on as well, is that I think they're basically operating our public forums now. So in the past, we might have thought of our public forums, the places where people went to express their views on issues of public concern to other members of the public and to get responses from other members of the public, were like the parks, the streets. Not everyone used those, but they were a place that you could go, stand on your soapbox, state your views. And those areas, those public forums, were essentially controlled by the government. They're usually on state property. And now I think we've seen a transformation where our public forums, where it is that people go to voice their opinions on matters of public concern and to get response from other members of the public, are these social media platforms. And so what was once controlled by the government, the public now is being controlled by private entities. And so given this kind of transformation in our public forums, we think are very important. I have found myself more sympathetic to the idea that perhaps citizens have a right to access those public forums. So that is not what First Amendment doctrine currently says, because those public forums are run by private entities. As Aileen has explained, technically in the black letter law, the First Amendment only applies to government actors. But I think there's some argument that private entities, when they're as powerful, and they're so powerful that they operate public forums, have to respect individuals' free speech rights. So this might be something along the lines of Eugene's speech principles, that companies need to follow certain free speech principles. So this makes me more open to potential government regulation to require non-discrimination in the access to these public forums. Now, the access part here is really important. So the ability to actually be in the public forum, to post on social media, and to be basically searchable on the social media platforms. I think there's something to that idea. There's this intuition that the public is picking up on, and I don't think it's the public alone. So even in First Amendment doctrine, there are areas I think where this intuition pokes through a little bit, that maybe the First Amendment has some purchase against private entities as well. There's a famous, very isolated case, Marsh versus Alabama, from the middle of the 20th century, that concluded that a private company, the Gulf Shipbuilding Corporation, owned an entire town, the town where its employees lived, that it needed to respect the free speech rights of people who were trying to use its streets to communicate messages on matters of public concern there. Even though technically those streets were not public streets, they were owned by this private corporation. And so the case has been very much like kind of cordoned off, and it's not very many implications outside of that context. But there are a few other cases where the court has applied to free speech principles, and I'm happy to talk more about this later against private entities. So I think there's like a little toehold, but it's small. Eileen, I would have answered your questions correctly under First Amendment doctrine, that technically the First Amendment doesn't apply against private entities. So that's one question about our access to public forums and whether we have some kind of. There's a second feature of the social media platforms that I've been thinking about a lot lately that goes beyond access. So it's not just that these companies provide the public forums themselves, they also structure those public forums in really important ways. So they promote some speech to our awareness. They tell us, hey, look at this speech, and therefore necessarily, don't focus on all the other speech. And in doing that, they really transform those public forums. And so I'm interested in the question of, to what extent might we think about this activity, this kind of, I call it filtering speech, curated speech, maybe if you prefer. To what extent could that be regulated by the government, given that it's happening in this public forum? And here there arises a tension for me. So on the one hand, I think that this curating function that the social media platforms are performing is essential, because there is so much speech out there in the public forum that it would really be impossible to have a functioning public forum without some kind of curator. We just don't have time. Like if our news feed on a social media platform was just everything that had been posted in chronological order, so you would basically get everything posted in the last second, and then you would scroll down and it would never end. That would not be a usable kind of public forum. So I think some form of curation is really important, and this is not a function that's new when it comes to social, like online public forums, or really with respect to the public sphere at all. We have always relied on kind of intermediary institutions between speakers and public to direct our attention. Okay, so newspapers, magazines, television, radio, all of these are these kind of curating institutions that pull out some of the speech for us to look at. And I think that's really very important function that's played. Ideally, it's played in a way that promotes quality that states don't do and that we, for good reasons, generally don't want states to be doing. It's a valuable function. So here's where the tension is. There's this valuable function being performed by social media companies, but I think there's a problem because that function itself gives those companies a huge amount of power to sort of form our informational environment. Right? Because as I said in the beginning, these are our new public forums, more or less, and those companies are able to structure what we're seeing most often, what we're paying attention to within those public forums, or how the speech is presented, which speech we're seeing. That concerns me as a theorist because so many of our decisions that are made, whether it's private individuals or as voters, are based on the information that we're getting in these public forums, which for a lot of people. And so, and even information that people get that's not from individual speakers on Facebook, information that's coming from magazines or online newspapers, a lot of it is filtered through these social media platforms. So what I worry about here is the concentration of power in the hands of a small number of media companies. So they're performing this valuable function, but I'm really concerned that they're performing alone, essentially, a very small number of people. So for me, the way forward in thinking about this seems like it has to involve more actors doing this curating and this filtering, having less concentration, sort of promoting additional actors in the space. So that could involve things like breaking up the companies. Though there are a lot of complications with antitrust law in this space. Another thing, this is just the last thing I'll say to put out there, is kind of a newer solution I've heard of, which has to do with middleware apps. So Stanford's Cyber Policy Center came out for a couple years ago, kind of touting the solution where the idea is that perhaps the government could do something to incentivize the creation of third-party software that would operate on top of the platforms. So you would go, say, to Facebook, and you would have a separate filtering app that would decide for you which speech you're going to see or not. It's totally independent of Facebook, and there would be market among these different apps, so that we would have a diversity of different companies who are providing security services. So there are a lot of complications in how that actually is implemented. Even Stanford said there's a lot more to be worked out with that. But I'm interested in solutions in that kind of space that focus on decentralized.
Yeah, let's jump right to those last 2 points then, because I think my original question was around perceptions of legitimacy. We've heard, we have this function. We have a function that is socially important that somebody perform, and we generally don't want government performing that function. I think that all three of our panelists agree on that. Okay, please.
Well, I'm sorry, there are two possible functions. One is the function of dealing with information. Oh, that's what you're talking about. I entirely agree. It's utterly crucial. And you don't want to kill that in order to promote some vision of non-discrimination. I mean, a classic example is Google search. Imagine Google search were told it had to be content neutral in its results. Even viewpoint neutral, it would be a pretty foolish thing, because when I search for what's the age of the Earth, I would like to know the kind of the scientific consensus view, unless otherwise specified. So that, I think we probably will agree is important. There's a second possible function, which is the function of blocking bad speech, making sure that the communists don't get to talk to us, or making sure that Putin doesn't get to talk to us, and not making sure that transphobes or anti-Chinese people, people who oppose either Chinese racial group or the Chinese government don't get to talk to us. Whatever your view of who it is should be barred, you might say, well, it's important that somebody be able to block their reach, not just through this recommendation, but even if they want to talk to their 80 million subscribers who voluntarily want to do it. I think we might disagree on whether that's a valuable.
Okay. But all right. So, why don't I give to Erin? Do you or Aileen want to respond to that question? But whether or not it's of the role of platforms as an intermediary and the need to curate, or, well, I guess not to curate, but to silence certain forms of speech. And if not, I can go on to the question that I was going to ask originally. All right. So the question that I was going to ask originally was we have some functions that platforms are performing which are important in terms of that filtration and curation function, not necessarily a silencing function, but a curation function is important, and it is important that we have platforms that are providing some sort of an intermediary service, right? And at the same time, we don't want governments doing this, and it is important that in performing this service, there are, to their operations, that there are some sort of perceptions of legitimacy. So the question then becomes, how do we either improve this process, or how do we cultivate greater perceptions of legitimacy among the platforms? We've heard one option is decentralization, and essentially break up these platforms so that there are more options available. Another one, I think you could potentially term vertical disintegration, perhaps. The idea that you disintegrate the moderation functions away from these platforms, such that there are independent third parties that are doing that. I'll add a third option myself, which is governance and process. I think that if the platforms were to strengthen their own governance, their own public accountability, their own transparency structures, that might help to foster avenues of perceptions of legitimacy and confidence in the system. Are any of those the answer? Are none of those the answer? Is legitimacy irrelevant? Does anyone have thoughts on that? Why don't we start with Erin and then, yeah.
Well, sure. So I guess because I'm if I put on one hand, I'm a democratic theorist. As soon as I hear the word legitimacy, I just think, what do we mean by legitimacy? So there are a lot of ways of thinking of legitimacy. And one way that I think that Eileen's work raises is the conception of legitimacy that's tied to public perception. So this is the question of, do people feel like the rules, whether the laws or in this case the content moderation decisions from companies, are justified? So that, I think, can be a relevant concern. You don't want people to be operating within communities and governments where they feel the laws are totally unfair. For me, it's not necessarily the most important thing, because sometimes people, I think, have misperceptions about what's fair. So I think it's a factor to think about. But for me, I think about other forms of legitimacy as being important in addition to public perception, that are going to be formed kind of more based in principles rather than polling. So one has to do with sort of an ethical form of legitimacy. When these companies are trying to justify their decisions, whether people buy it or not, are those the justifications? And I think some of the concerns there have to do with whether or not the companies are in fact providing people with good information, whether they're providing a diverse range of views, whether they're allowing people to kind of autonomously exercise their own judgments rather than manipulating them to achieve judgments that are intended by the filter. I think all those are principles that are going to be really relevant in asking, are these decisions justifiable? And if we're thinking about those things, I think process could help. It can generate decisions that follow principles like that. I think process can also help in terms of a little bit in terms of generating public perception of legitimacy. Though I would have to see the polling on that. I don't know how much the public really pays attention to the procedures that are happening. In fact, I think Facebook's Supreme Court would be an interesting case of this. Like, that seems like a major procedural decision that Facebook has taken to kind of guide its decisions and make them more principled. But at the same time, I'm not sure it's had an impact on the perception of legitimacy of those decisions. But I guess I want to talk about one last form of legitimacy that I'm concerned about, that I think were implicit in my earlier remarks, which have to do with democratic legitimacy. So the implications that these big companies have for our democratic decisions. And for me, the procedural copying up of the procedural guidance for these decisions and building in more rules to bind the company's hands themselves doesn't do quite enough on the democratic legitimacy front, because I think that the possession of the power that these companies have is in itself already a concern even if they have rules in place, that are supposed to be produce principled decisions, even if the public is okay with the decisions that they make in the long run. I'm still very concerned about the capacity that they have, or the capacity that some future owner of those companies might have. I think it's kind of been in the news lately, to shape public opinion and therefore electoral decisions. So I guess for me, that is still going to be a concern, even if we're able to.
So I want to put all of these concerns that both of you raised back to Aileen then, whose own research is driving at public perceptions of legitimacy and understanding of the content moderation process. What do you see us driving towards there? And do you see the relationship between all these concerns and the potential results that you saw in your research?
So I've studied particularly the relationship of the First Amendment rather than free speech generally, because what I saw in the dialogue is that is what people use, possibly as a correct shorthand, possibly because the Constitution seems to occupy for many Americans like a special spiritual or moral place. I don't know if my experiences are atypical, but the number of times I have heard someone in like a bodega say, "Oh, like I have a constitutional," like I don't know why I've heard that word in bodega, but I've heard it many times because maybe we get education in this, or for whatever reason, it seems to be like a rhetorical device. So I think it's interesting from that perspective, and I do think that's related to legitimacy. It seems to be something we all sort of assume is taken for granted, and we're not going to revisit that. So if I can anchor my preferences or my rights in the Constitution, I somehow feel that is like a more compelling argument, like as a layperson, not my hypothesis. So I think that is part of it. I'm not sure this fully responds to your question, but something that's on my mind, both from the panels earlier today and then from what Erin said just now, is also related to, I wonder if it's something about content moderation or curation that is really driving the discussion, or is it purely the bigness? And are we having all these First Amendment discussions when really we should just be having antitrust discussions? And I guess that's a question I want to put to you, because my instinct as someone who's sort of more oriented, to the extent doctrinally oriented towards private law, I think I would never ask about the legitimacy of the supermarket deciding not to stock vanilla soy milk, and that's really what I want. Like I would never have that thought, maybe because the supermarket is never going to control that much of my life more than anything. I can go to the other supermarket and get my vanilla. And so would all this go away if we could just have 50 Facebooks, which a lot of people are writing about right now? Because content moderation could be very salient, and it could be something people marketed themselves on. And I wonder if that happened, could this whole debate go away? We don't need to worry about legitimacy once we have 50 Facebooks. And Elon doesn't have to be a 4-letter word. Like we don't need to know about it. That'd be lovely. But like, is this question of legitimacy something intrinsic to content curation, no matter how popular your forum is, or is it only because these things have gotten so big and so out of control?
So I should think that's a very important point. It's an important, I don't think we need this. It's an important point both as a practical matter and as a conceptual matter. As a practical matter, it would be really good if we were in an environment where people's reaction was, okay, I don't like your policies, I'll go somewhere else. Right, a bookstore. Well, you don't stock Milton Friedman here. Well, yes, we're a socialist bookstore. We don't like Milton Friedman. Okay, fine. I'm going to go to a free market bookstore. I'm going to go to a bookstore that markets itself as, if somebody got a Nobel Prize in economics, we'll stock it, or something along those lines. That would be good. That would be a lot better. One problem, of course, is that because of network effects, if you simply just break up Facebook into 10 Facebooks, and like you split up the user base 1/10 of each one, well, then and not that I use Facebook much, but let's say my wife, who does use it some to follow her friends, she's only going to see 1/10 of her friends, right? So what I think would be really required here is not so much antitrust law as mandated interoperability. So one reason, for example, that we don't have much complaints about email services deciding whether to block someone, first of all, they don't. I think they see that as speaking, but also on top of that, if I can't use Gmail, then I can easily use somebody else. Because it's all interoperable, right? By switching from Gmail to Outlook.com, I'm not going to lose access to all of my friends who are on Gmail. Whereas by switching from Facebook to MeWe, I guess that's supposedly the competitor, I won't be able to see any of my friends. So you might have a requirement that says essentially every platform has to be set up interoperably so that if MeWe can, if I join MeWe, it can import my Facebook contact list and then allow me to friend people on Facebook. And then have its own content moderation rules. Facebook will have its own, and there'll be lots of other things that people could pick and choose. I think that would be great in many ways. It would be a much more serious restraint on the business's property rights and their ability to capitalize over their very substantial investment in their technology. To basically say you've got to open everything up precisely so that competitors can access it. Much more serious than imposing some sort of content neutrality mandate or some such. This doesn't mean it's wrong, although if you care at all about property rights, as I certainly do, you might ask, is this in one of the rare areas where property rights should yield to maybe some democratic legitimacy concerns, some antitrust concerns, or is it not? But I do think politically this would be extraordinary, because whatever, you can imagine Facebook saying, look, if you want to impose a neutrality mandate, at least in our hosting, secretly we love it, because that means that whenever somebody says we demand that you block somebody, we demand you remove somebody, or other, say no, our hands are tied, right? So the phone company, for example, imagine if the phone company were to tell you, and not just the landline, but also the famously competitive cell phone services were to tell you, I'm sorry, we know that you've been using a phone line to communicate your Antifa or your communist or your KKK or your NRA or whatever else views. So we're just going to cancel your phone. I think most of us, those of us who know First Amendment law, would say that's not a First Amendment violation. We would say that's kind of odd. Maybe that does get to be something of a free speech problem, even if Facebook isn't. And in fact, it is actually a violation of common carrier laws. So you can imagine, and I've argued that it's a plausible position to say Facebook and Twitter should be that way, but indeed it would be much more effective in many ways for the purposes of diversity of opinion and such to have these this kind of interoperability requirement. My prediction is they would fight it tooth and nail. It goes straight to their bottom line and straight to what they think are their legitimate ability to kind of take advantage of the audience that they've built up, and they would fight that much more than they'd fight common carrier. That's my guess.
So I'm gonna jump in and make a slightly tongue-in-cheek. I'm gonna play devil's advocate for a second and make a slightly tongue-in-cheek argument in favor of massive concentration of social media companies. So yes, there are a lot of interesting proposals around interoperability. There are some privacy concerns related to that. Ideally, there's some way that you can square that circle. Another option is through federated content moderation structures, which essentially decentralize out the moderation rules within a single platform. Is the counter argument to that that there are benefits to having everybody experiencing the same online reality? For many years, balkanization was sort of the big bad word of the internet. We didn't want things broken up. Likewise, having just come through the pandemic, is there, if you think about the measures the platforms took to combat COVID misinformation, would we have been better off if, under those circumstances, folks could just essentially retreat back to their siloed communities, either COVID denialism or election denialism or what have you? Is there a benefit to having centralized structures that establish rules of the road for everybody, and ideally that push people together into the same reality and in some ways prevent echo chambers, prevent polarization, or is that completely wrong?
Do you think that worked well to prevent polarization? That Facebook and Twitter and such decided to block views that they thought were wrong, which they probably were right to think were wrong with regard to COVID. Do you think that actually diminished polarization? Might it have actually exacerbated polarization? Not necessarily polarization is bad. Remember, all of us remember times when people complain about polarization, and times when people say, oh, the parties, they're just the same, Tweedledum, Tweedledee, right? And then people say, you know, we need more separate identities for each party so the voters have real options. Then they get the real options. And then, oh no, there's so much more polarization. We need something more centrist. So I'm not sure that polarization is bad. But if it is, do we have any real reason to think that saying essentially our masters in big tech land are going to tell us what we can and we can't say? So all you folks should get less polarized and should go along with the program. Do you think that actually diminishes polarization? Maybe it does, but I'm not sure. Why would we think that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm not convinced that it diminishes polarization either, because it focuses attention in a way. And we already have a very polarized public, and then everyone's focusing on the same thing. And it's arguable, at least I'm sitting here with more data, but it's arguable that that increases polarization, I think. But I guess what I'll say with a broader question, like, is centralization actually better, is I think you're making an important point here, that if we had a public sphere that was fully fractured, where everyone was just in their own silos, we would really lose something. It would be hard to have kind of public conversations that are kind of cutting across different groups. It would be hard to kind of take advantage of all the different perspectives that people have, because we would all just be, you know, in our own little echo chambers. So at least to me, it's undeniable that that's not the world that we want. But I don't want to, in order to avoid that, go to the opposite and have complete centralization. So for me, the ideal is to have something in the middle, where we don't just have one set of private rules that are governing the public space. I mean, this is obviously, you know, for some publication now, that there are a few different companies, but there's a kind of oligopoly on the rules of media. And I would just like to see more curators out there. So not, you know, one for every 10,000 people out there, but you know, many more than we have. So reduce, and I think that in cases where, or in like media markets where you have more participants, like the radio market and whatnot, newspapers, you do tend to get some degree of a public sphere, like overlapping information that people are getting, right? So newspapers tend to have a lot of things, and that's a good thing. But there are going to be slight differences in how they cover it. And I think those differences are really
So 2 points. One is empirically, there's some depressing news that, at least for some people, exposure to alternate points of view pushes them further in the opposite direction, speculated to backfire, effect, and detriment. So it is possible, as you will recognize, that it wouldn't necessarily reduce polarization, and it could exacerbate it, sort of say everyone has to be on the same page. And I guess another thought I'm having here is, are we looking to social media to do work and make up for failures we've had elsewhere? So something that strikes me, and I hate to sound like some 80-year-old, like I've seen things.
Kids these days.
I've seen things, but I have a sense that we in the U.S., maybe I'm wrong, but we have a decreasingly sort of shared reality apart from social media anyway, right? Like there's more income stratification. There's more states passing crazy education rules. That means our basic education is going to look increasingly different. You know, we have plenty of evidence. I don't know if things have gotten worse, but that, you know, the rule of law may be different depending on your income, and you know, those services get more expensive, then like access to justice is even less equal, and all these things. So I wonder, to some extent, we're so obsessed with polarization on the internet, but I also know when I walk around and go somewhere where someone's working a low-wage job, that I'm already living such a different reality from them. And so are we just looking to social media to cure these ills, and it's perhaps the last place we should.
Well, but so interestingly, it's my understanding, and I haven't seen the stats, but I feel pretty confident about this, is that when it comes to accessibility of information, we have dramatically reduced social stratification of accessibility of information, simply because information has become so cheaply available. I'll just give you one data. Came to America, and we were very poor. This is 1975, we came from the Venezuela. And I remember my parents, at some point, they managed to get enough money that one of the first purchases, once they had enough, was a 30-volume set of the Encyclopedia Britannica, which which I rarely read except my parents. We were very close family. We were always very prudish on certain things. So I learned about sex by looking at the SB to SN volume of the encyclopedia. I don't know if they anticipated that. Maybe they'd say, yes, that's why we bought it, so you can learn things this way. But that was important. They were college educated in the Soviet Union. They managed to make some money. For many people, it would have been completely inaccessible. The kids could have gone to the library. Well, of course, it's hard to go to the library. Now, anybody with a cell phone or anybody even with a dial-up connection can access Wikipedia, which is not perfect, but neither was the Encyclopedia Britannica, right? Likewise, with regard to consumption of news. Now, you could get free news instead of subscribing to a newspaper, which is what you used to do. You get free news from almost any newspaper in the country with all these possible ideological perspectives. To be sure, a few of them actually do have paywalls, but a lot of them don't. So you have much more accessibility. Certainly that's true for entertainment. So now there may be problems with it. Maybe the fact that people don't have to subscribe to newspapers anymore helps cause the crisis, especially in local. So I'm not saying this is perfect, but I am saying that in terms of social stratification, whatever the effects may have been as to other things, my sense is with regard to accessibility, maybe not the willingness or interest in access, but accessibility of information, it is sharp. My guess is it's sharp.
But isn't that somewhat mitigated by the fact that people also have immediate and ready access to absolute garbage information?
Yes, it's true. You can have access to garbage, and you can have, and the rich have access to garbage too. It's a really interesting question whether the rich consume more better information than the poor, or they just have access to the same kind of garbage and have their own preferred. Maybe everybody has their own preferred garbage. Certainly, if you want to, if you are poor but rich enough to have some kind of device at home or easily accessible, whether it's a smartphone or, again, just an old computer with a dial-up line, and you want to access non-garbage, you can. Certainly, there's plenty of garbage for you to access.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I will just say that I don't know on net whether the more information has been good or not. I definitely hear Eugene's point that the increased access to potentially good information is wonderful from the internet, but there's a lot of garbage, and I just don't know whether there's been a net benefit from that increased access or not. But I will say that sort of setting that empirical issue aside, the potential just seems amazing to me, and even to respond to you're saying earlier, Aileen, some of the stratification that we find in everyday life, because I'm sure you've read the information on how kind of political sorting that happens in the country, like the big sort. I just went to a talk last week where there's an article of the scientist who's presenting new information on political segregation, and the results are really stark. That people particularly in either very urban areas or very rural areas, see people sort of the opposite political persuasion almost never in their immediate area. People, in the suburbs have a little bit better. But the result is, I do think that the internet has some potential there to expose people to creative views that they wouldn't necessarily see in the environment. I say limited because, of course, people make choices when they go online about where they go. They've already kind of been formed within an echo chamber. They do tend to make choices that, put them into similar echo chambers, and that can, in some cases, exacerbate the problems in a larger community. But that's not always the case. And my understanding, a theorist and not as comfortable with empirical data, is that some of the new studies in political science suggest that actually people's media diets online, even under all the current rules with the current social media companies, are relatively diverse. It's like a bell curve, and most people are seeing, media from different kinds of sources, like some from Fox, some from MSNBC. They're mostly mainstream, but not like it's kind of the tail ends that are super isolated in echo chambers. So at least I guess I hold out hope that access to internet speech can kind of counterbalance just some of these isolating factors that we have in the physical world.
Whenever anybody says hope, I'm reminded of my favorite joke. It was said, is a Russian joke said about Poles in Russia. And they're always stereotypes of never a stereotype of Poles as stupid. That Poles are seen as an intellectual nation, but they're seen as morose. And Poles, if you know any of European history, have much to be morose about. So one of the questions. So the man asks a Pole, "How are things going?" He says, "Better, better than tomorrow, of course. Worse than yesterday."
So I want to, it's always tough to follow jokes, but I do want to take us back briefly to a couple more questions before we throw it over to Q&A. One of them is, I want to ask all three of you your thoughts about the applicability of free speech as a principle, not necessarily free speech as a constitutional legal idea, but free speech as a broader principle to the decision-making that private platforms make in terms of their own content policies. And whether the notion that Facebook, by virtue of principled freedom of expression stand, needs to have the ability to curate content on its own platform and to decide what it will or will not carry. Any of you? Aileen? Yeah. So, you know, as I guess it comes down to the question. So I've heard arguments made that in fact, quite recently by Erin who uses a pretty direct analogy between Facebook's moderation policies and the editorial process at newspapers. I think that's a bit of a stretch, but certainly, you know, within ideas of freedom of expression, I think that I've also heard very impassioned commentary from web hosting providers about how they have been personally offended by particular types of websites they were hosting, and they'll be damned if they'll be forced to carry this kind of content because they just find it absolutely abhorrent. And again, this is not from a platform, this is from a web hosting provider, which is far closer to the infrastructure layer. So I sort of wanted to put that, both questions to the three of you as folks who engage with freedom of expression, freedom of speech principles, so how you view that within the ecosystem of our social values around promoting and supporting freedom of expression.
Well, let me suggest, since nobody else has chimed in, I think you might tie into the point that Erin made, which I think is tremendously important. There are certain institutions that we rely on to deal with problems of information. We need to have Google search, newspapers, magazines, perhaps old-fashioned bookstores. I'm not sure that's true of Amazon. For those, we should cherish the fact that they pick and choose. We might say, you know, we're hoping you're kind of open-minded. We might want the newspaper to have on its op-ed page not completely everybody on exactly the same wavelength. That's a weird mixed metaphor there. But we certainly want them to pick and choose who appears, and they have to. And if they do it just on a random basis, or even a content neutral basis, like we're going to have the 6 most popular columnists. I don't think that's good. On the other end is the phone company, right? Or possibly email services. Or another example is UPS and FedEx. Even if they say, you know, we just hate that communist bookstore because, you know, we're a capitalist organization, we make money off of these things. We don't want to support communists. They can't say we won't deliver books for them because they're commentarian, right? Likewise, when it comes to universities, for example, it is at least a fairly common view that private universities, USC, Harvard, maybe not the super religious ones, but at least private universities, by the way, that's actually the law in California, have to allow student groups to host whomever they want to host. That part is not the law, actually, but that's a common view. And the law in California is you can't expel a student because simply of that student's willingness. At the same time, we surely don't want private universities to be content neutral in their curriculum, right? We want them to carefully curate the curriculum, again, subject to various constraints about open-mindedness, about professional standards and such, but certainly not content or viewpoint. So I think we need to see where things are. If it's at the point where there's real social value that's provided by by curation, and especially when there's relatively easy exit. Then in that case, it's good to have them filter this way. If there's very little value provided, not zero value, but little value other than as a means of diminishing the reach of all ideas, like with a phone company, there's relatively little value in the phone company being able to say, we just refuse to host call-in lines for bad ideas. Then I think we should be, at least there should be norms that suggest that's not their job and we don't want them to do that. And possibly enforce the law, especially when exit is difficult. Then there are interesting questions about acoustic, where exit may be relatively easy and relatively even seamless, like in a day or two, switch to a different host, but not if everybody's on the same wavelength, right? And everybody has the same ideology. And it's not like hosting services do actually provide important information overload management services. One other related area that I'll turn things over. This is an issue that's come up a lot in before. But it turns out, if you want to say, well, does the First Amendment bar, let's say, I don't know, Sony from firing a sound engineer because the sound engineer is a conflict? The answer is, of course not. Sony is not the government. But if you ask, is it legal for Sony to do that? The answer is no. It violates state law. Interestingly, about half the states and sometimes counties, sometimes cities, have such laws that more or less ban discrimination based on political speech or political affiliation or ideology, and it varies. Some, like in California, protect speech generally. Washington State only protects speech that's very closely linked to the electoral process. All states pretty much say you can't fire someone just based on who they vote. So there are different decisions, and I think this reflects a little bit. Do we want employers to have the opportunity to say, no, I refuse to work with Nazis, or I refuse to work with communists, or I refuse to work with people who just, let's say I'm a meat company and I don't want to hire vegans, or at least vegan activists. I don't care what they eat, but if they're actively trying to promote prohibition on my line of business, let's say, being foie gras, and they're trying to stop that, I just don't want them working with me because they are Judicists and I can't trust them. Do we want employers to be able to say that, or do we say, that gives employers a little too much power, private entities' ability to leverage their economic power, especially given that jobs are often not easy to switch, not seamless to switch, to leverage their economic power or political power, we need to block that. And it turns out that the conversation is ongoing in America because some states have one approach and some another.
So I think one thing you said that as an empirical question.
I want to hear more about it.
I think it's really interesting and important to know is you mentioned how, to some extent, whether someone has to be content neutral as a commentary, you're sort of, when you get into certain businesses, you know you're signing up for that, right? So for example, when people go to medical school, I think to some extent they have this sense of, I am signing up for, even if this Nazi walks in, but
Right.
I'm signing up for, I'm going to fix it. And people who say, I couldn't live with that, they don't become doctors, possibly for that reason. And maybe that's like a really good social sorting. And this reminds me actually a bit about Christoph's paper, where we were talking about infrastructure and to what extent should infrastructure have to be content neutral, so something like a payment system. So we've
Right.
seen right now, it's not clear that a payment system is a comment carrier.
Right.
And so those people then do feel called upon to make a moral judgment. I am not required to process payments, donations for the neo-Nazis, and therefore it's my decision. If it's on me, then I'm sure as hell not going to do it. And so I think this is where law can also have this expressive function and tell people, you are not morally responsible. We as a society have decided that this is forwarding social values or economic efficiency or whatever, but we are taking the moral onus off of you.
Right.
And then if people, what they perceive themselves as doing is, I am doing something that is socially endorsed, that is useful, they can feel good about their work. Whereas if they're not having this guidance and there's no guidance, perhaps there's no stable norm foundation, and they feel they are on their own processing the neo-Nazi payment, and what is their spouse going to think when they go home and tell them? That's like a very different experience. And so where law can even establish norms and move society towards those norms, and we agree those are productive norms, I think that's.
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with all of that. It's been said quite eloquently. Maybe I'll just
Shocking.
add
We all agree.
one small thought, which is just about it goes back to your anecdote, Michael, of the one provider who just doesn't want to a person's ability to state their opinion about various groups and other ideas. So like if you have a private blog and you want to put up there, you know, these are all my favorite newspapers, magazines, columnists, whatever, your ability to sort of recommend those things to the public is your own speech act, which is kind of your saying, I prefer this speech. And I think there's sometimes a tendency to collapse that kind of thinking with what Aileen and Eugene have just been talking about, which is more like gatekeeping functions, where someone is actually, you know, providing a job to someone or providing a platform to someone to speak on, where the questions about whom you're recommending or not, or promoting or not, are not just about your kind of personal opinion, but they have very real social consequences and consequences for like the larger discourse. And so I think when we think about that category of cases of curation, where it's not just expressing your opinion, but it's like you're actually keeping the gate and deciding who gets in, that's where I think these questions of like social value come in, where you want to ask, do we want people to be able to curate in this circumstance? And in many cases, we do want people to be able to curate, such as in newspaper cases and radio and all that kind of thing. But at least for me, the bigger the company gets, that's part of the calculus, the less likely that curation is going to be helpful. That is, if the company is really kind of providing the gateway to the main area where everyone wants to be, that's where I want to put plans.
Great. Well, this has been a very rich discussion. I have some time for Q&A. So maybe we'll start with Jillian and then to Courtney.
Sure. Since you're all agreeing with each other, I'll continue. So I think you're not really grappling with the technology here of platforms and the business model of platforms. So this is a discussion like curation. It's going to be like the editorial board. It's employers deciding who we want to allow to work here. But and Erin, you sort of appealed to this idea that, you know, we actually need to have a mechanism to order all that stuff. And in fact, what we've got are machine learning-based systems that are doing this in an automated way. And they're being trained on the basis of the business model of platforms. And the business model of the platforms is to sell advertising, right, and to sell access. And we've built these models based on the behavioral clips. And the model has figured out what you're sort of discovering, like the hidden features of human behavior. Oh, actually, if I tell people more about how stupid our constitutional laws are, they'll get even more sure that we exploited all of those things behaviorally. So I think there was nodding their heads around the idea, well, if we broke it up and had more of them, then we had competition. And that's our marketplace of ideas. And I just don't think it applies here. I think no matter how much you broke them up, they're still going to be operating on that model of building those recommender systems. And that we need to be thinking about how are we going to interact with those systems, which is a totally different set of questions than about, you know, should they have a right to limit what speech is on the system or not. So I think I'm just not here. And so let me just put this to the question that to the point of the title of the discussion, which is about legitimacy. I don't think the legitimacy question goes away, even if we had a bunch of them competing. So the legitimate question is this what corporations operating inside this kind of business model, using this kind of technology, you know, can that have legitimacy in terms of a tremendous impact about information?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I will say that I very much share your concerns. So for me, there are kind of a couple of different questions here. I've been focusing mostly on power concerns, and for me, those are quite foundational issues, and I'll explain how those are kind of related in a second. But I think there's a separate sort of question, which is what would the ideal system be for promoting speech or not? And I definitely have ideas about what a better system would be than what we have. I certainly think that the current business models that have focused largely on pushing engagement. So the more that people engage with the material, the more that they see it. So sometimes that means the more sensationalist it is, team, the more he's going to climb in the rankings. I think that's incredibly concerning as a way to structure public discourse. And so I think, you know, if I was working within one of these companies and was in charge of the algorithms, I would pay attention to questions like that. Think that this is not justifiable on the legitimacy question, given how much responsibility we have in this, given kind of our economic position, given how many people are relying on us for information, it's not responsible to use an algorithm like that. And I think those are really important questions that any company that was in a position like that should think about. But I do think that the question is, how do we get that? And I don't think there's any, and this brings us to power questions, like who's going to implement that? And I'm not sure that we can have like a from the top down one model to rule them all that's determined by either a monopolistic company or the government, because I just think in either case there are a lot of pressures you know, to differently distort the algorithms. So I guess I'm with you in that I would like a world in which, you know, the algorithms are feeding us information that is diverse and quality and stimulates thinking, but I'm not sure I'm not sure how we get that. So for me, the idea of breaking up the companies, or yes, more realistically, maybe mandating interoperability or trying to come up with a middleware solution or something like that, is maybe, as far as I can tell, the best we can hope for. So the hope is that if you have competition, if you have competition, that different filters will be appealing to different segments of the population,
right.
And so hopefully it will, you know, and presumably quality is something that a lot of people are going to want, and so they'll have some people, you know, some filters who are searching for looking for quality. Not all of them are just going to go on the engagement metric, because that's not going to give them an advantage over, you know, other filters. And so the hope is just if you create a market that's better than the current kind of centralized. At least that's. I don't think it's a perfect answer, but that's kind of the way that I'm thinking about it.
Right, I think that's exactly right. Let me just add. So I think there are two kinds of things going on with the platform algorithms. There are ones that are aimed at maximizing kind of user time spent on the platform. And then there are ones where the platform says, we think that it's just Donald Trump is bad for the country, where that we believe in one view of transgender questions and not the opposite view, and that's what we want. I think competition is going to diminish that latter. In fact, among other things, because some of the competitors will have different views about Donald Trump and different views about transgender issues and such. It's true that to the extent that what they're giving, what's wrong with the platforms is they're giving us too much of what we want, but maybe shouldn't want, or maybe too much of what we really want, as opposed to what we want to want. Then in that case, it's true, when you have competition, you know, that will be largely duplicated because it reflects an unfortunate reality in consumer preferences, right? If you have a whole bunch more restaurants, maybe fast food restaurants, maybe most of them are going to have fatty and sugary foods because that's what people like, and there will be some that have health food, but not that much. But still, on balance, I think Erin is quite right. Presumably, there's something of a market for people who want healthier food or some such, and presumably there will be more people who say, you know, I don't want that sensationalist algorithm stuff because it actually doesn't work for me, or maybe even I'll tie myself to the mast. I'll deliberately choose something because I have the strength to choose that, even if I'm too weak to avoid clicking on the clickbait. I have the strength to choose something that doesn't give me the clickbait. So I don't think we can solve all the problems, but I do think that the legitimacy concern, to the extent that it is, at least one facet of it, is with essentially the rich people who run these companies, deciding what it is that we should or shouldn't be viewing, even if we want to view it. And if it's that they're deciding that they want to give us more of what we want, even though it's really bad for the country if they do that, I'm not sure that's a legitimacy problem. It's still a serious problem, but it's true that the same solutions wouldn't apply there. And I'm not sure it's solvable.
So I think there's a big behavioral and empirical literature
Well, there you go.
that gives us some hope and some for a variety of reasons, either with microeconomic modeling, or if you just look at people being fairly irrational. So we say, okay, that's why maybe something like GDPR may be better, just enforce standards, because people like firms are just not going to compete on privacy. There is some initial evidence, and I will self-promote, I have a smidgen of work on this, that in like attention markets, this attention extraction element, there might be some competition there if you break things up. So unlike privacy, it's just never going to be salient. There's some hope that if you broke up products on this metric, there might be people appreciating having less attention extraction, less of this clickbaity engagement maximization. Now, we don't have enough data to be sure of that, but there's at least hope as compared to privacy, where I think there is no hope that firms will compete on privacy. So this could address the second question. So apart from the filter and everyone getting a better filter, just would we have firms who are successful because they deliver a good product that helps me do what my better self wants me to do, rather than possibly bringing out my worse self or creating.
Maybe I'll just add one other thing from literature that I've seen. That's again a little bit helpful, which is not so much on the clickbaity stuff, but on looking at opposing opinions. If you ask people directly, do you want to be looking at opposing opinions, or just look at information that confirms your, or the information that's kind of from within your own camp, then a lot of people actually say that they want to see information on both sides, or actually want to see more information on the other side. It's still, I think it's like 35% that say they'd like to, just to see the information that comes from their own side. But it's a lot of people who say otherwise. That doesn't seem to be reflected in their behavior, right? So not tend to gravitate toward things that confirm their own views. This seems to be the issue of the Facebook and newsfeed, where you just hit click on things and will reveal that they kind of do sort of want this. But if their meta preference, what they want is actually to have some more engagement with the user, unlike their own that might challenge them, then it might suggest that if they were allowed to choose a different filtering device, maybe in some cases they would.
But you can't know that. You can actually go in and change all your settings. No.
I had no idea even that you could.
And there are
overlay
No,
filters you can.
But maybe part of the problem is that people don't really want to do it. It's just that they're not aware of it.
So that's the point of the market.
Well, just maybe on that note, it is worth noting, going back to the fatty food and sugary food analogy, we have all kinds of ways that we nudge people to make healthier choices. We tax certain kinds of foods, we reduce their availability to kids, or their ability to advertise against. Obviously, the analogy only goes so far, and when you translate that into the information it makes us relevant, it gets problematic. But there are all kinds of nudges that are applied. Maybe Courtney and then Erin.
So a couple of things. One is, it does seem to me that we're similar to the infrastructure panel we had earlier. We're talking about like platforms, but really we're talking about a handful of platforms, because you don't really see people complaining about like, Pinterest or Twitch moderating like the content, right? We're talking about the big four, right? Facebook, Twitter, Google, YouTube. Maybe does anyone use Bing? No. So you never hear about that, right? So I also feel like it'd be helpful if we actually talk about what we're talking about. So if we're talking about a few really important expressive platforms, then I would ask, how does responsibility play into this? And how could the fact that you have paid speech, right? This is not just pure expressive speech. You can also pay to prioritize your speech, to advertise your speech, etc. And to that extent, this is also fundamentally different, I think, than say newspapers or other types of public fora, because it's not just about people click on preferences. There's an entire industry that underlies the surveillance economy, where these algorithms are running on data. So it's not like you're just expressing your preferences and what you want to engage with. There's this entire behavioral economy under that is nudging you or pushing you or compelling you to engage in certain ways. And so it seems to me that that's fundamentally different. And so I wonder, should we be thinking about, to go to your point earlier about, the supermarket, for example, should they have to carry a certain brand, of soy milk or whatever, almond milk, or whatever it was, similar, you can't, before that almond milk even gets onto the store shelf, it has to go through an FDA approval process. So should we have some sort of review licensing process hurdles that need, add some friction before you can just, start to gather everyone's data and then use that to create these algorithms that are both engaging and manipulative.
I have to say, I've always been quite hesitant about complaints about micro-targeting of information to people. That generally speaking, first of all, I think most people would like, maybe they think if they are told too much about it, they think it's creepy, but I think most people would like to see certainly ads for products, but also information that is targeted to them, right? I mean, the reason ads work is sometimes I see an ad for something and I buy it and it's actually really good. If I'm going to have to see ads, I'd rather see ads that some tech people designed an algorithm that really hit my buttons, because I like to think that, that those are things I'm going to be particularly interested in. I think there have been some T-shirts, for example, that I just discovered certain T-shirt companies, which I like very much because I saw an ad for it. And if they had given me T-shirts with things that weren't kind of targeted to me, maybe I would never have bought it. So likewise with regard to political micro-targeting, lots of people are worried about that. I can see why they're worried about it. But if you think about it, if you're a politician and you're not trying to micro-target, you're an idiot, right? Imagine sort of traditional Norman Rockwell-y politics in the small town, right? Or or equally just in any jurisdiction which is small enough that somebody can go and talk to the voters as individuals. You're not going to tell the farmer the same message that you're going to tell the shopkeeper. I mean, if you're honest, you're not going to tell them the opposite messages. Of course, the dishonest politicians in all systems, but you certainly are going to try to target the message to them. It's a smart thing for you, but it's also useful for them. Like if they're trying to figure out whom to vote for, they're going to want to hear what those people have to say about the things that they care about. So I just don't think that the use of information about people to decide what information to show them, what information to prioritize, either by way of product advertising or by way of ideological advertising, or just by way of what gets into their feed, I don't think that's a minus. I think on balance, it's a plus.
Even though you have so much, I mean, you have, for example, the Black Lives Matter, narrative being overtaken by Russian disinformation efforts, and you have the, it's not just micro-targeting, like, hey, I want your message. I'm going to use these behavioral, psychological behavioral mechanisms to try to compel you. And it's not like, is it worth like, oh, you got to buy the T-shirt you really wanted, but meanwhile, we, allow these information operations, especially by foreign agents, that undermine democratic practice.
So there are two, I think, separate questions. One is, what do you do about foreign speech? And I'm trying to think about it as a complicated question. On the one hand, in fact, actually, the Supreme Court has said foreign speech is constitutionally protected because Americans may want to see it in order to access it. The very first case in which the Supreme Court ever struck down a federal statute on First Amendment grounds, Lamont v. Postmaster General in 1965, involved an attempt to restrict communist propaganda being sent from foreign countries, largely from foreign governments, into the US. And the court struck that down because it interfered with Americans' ability to access it. You can debate whether that's good or bad, but that's going to be true even if you don't have micro-targeting, because you might, if you're worried about Putin trying to affect our elections, you might be worried about him trying to affect it through non-micro-targeting, through macro-targeting as well. There are lots of things he can do without this kind of private information. So then the separate question is it good that people in general are able to target their message towards those who they see as Black Lives Matter supporters, or those who they see as Trump supporters, or those who they see as NRA supporters? I think on balance, it probably is, especially if imagine you're an advocacy group, a good advocacy group, you advocate good ideas, but you have a limited advertising budget. Is it really better to say you have to spend the advertising budget in a way that reaches everybody? So you have to reach 100,000 people. That's going to cost you $10,000. That's the only money you've got to spend on it. You have to reach 100,000 people, of whom maybe 2% are sympathetic to you. Or we can reach a different set of 100,000 people that, based on the micro-targeting, it turns out 70% are sympathetic to you, and they'd be willing to contribute to your cause, or they'd be willing to endorse your idea about whatever it is. I don't see why we should be that upset by that. In fact, I think there would be a strong First Amendment argument that advocacy groups' rights of speech should extend to the right to try to speak whenever possible to those people who are most sympathetic to their views. Separate question of where foreign governments should put it.
I guess I will say something that cuts a little bit against that. So,
well, good. Finally, some disagreement on that.
So this is kind of setting aside the power questions for now, but I agree that there's definitely some of crafting with advocacy micro-targeting allows, but there's something that I'm frequently worried about with micro-targeting nonetheless, which is having fractured public spheres. So we talked about that a little bit earlier, where a lot of groups are concerned because when one side targets their message to a certain number of people, they target this message to those people and a different message to other people. There are like 82 versions of the same message out there, and then it's very hard for like groups who are trying to respond to the right groups. And there's not a lot of transparency from these platforms on exactly where the advertising is going. So I do think you get into an interesting space where it's harder to have kind of responsive speech. And I'd have to know a little bit more about the issues to figure out whether this is decisive for me, because there still is a lot that groups can do to try to generally combat a group's message. But I don't know, I do find it somewhat compelling, this idea that it's hard, that it's harder to really have true responsiveness. So I guess in that respect, I think this is good. And I will say also on the data perspective, data issue, so this is not my main area of study. One thing that does concern me about how it's used to usually direct people toward more of the same. So like if you liked t-shirts in this particular area, then rather than being exposed to t-shirts in a different area, or maybe non-t-shirts, you like start getting more t-shirts, collecting more t-shirts that are in this area. And I think there's some concern that the more we're kind of like pigeonholed by the algorithms through our data, the less kind of diverse our experiences are going to be. So that's kind of a background worry that I have that's somewhat unhelpful.
Can I just ask a quick follow-up question? Imagine somebody says, Jane Smith, she's running for mayor. What's really sinister? Whenever she talks to different groups, she has somewhat different versions of her message. Like she talks to lawyers about one thing and she talks to steelworkers about another thing. And I'm trying to run against her and I don't have recordings of each one of these. I know roughly what she's saying, but how can I possibly respond to that? I mean, I take it our answer would be, maybe Jane Smith deserves to be mayor because she's a savvy politician who reaches out to people with the views that she thinks will reach them. And again, maybe it's too bad if she's actually lying to people and taking advantage of this, being able to lie without, or being inconsistent without exposure. But on balance, the fact that you, as whoever's trying to respond, doesn't fully know everything that she said and fully know how to respond to the whole complex, well, too bad for you. You set up your own campaign that conveys your message, preferably in different ways, to people who can be reached by different approaches.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I just don't think about this in terms of like winning an election. So I'm thinking more about people getting good information. So I guess I think that the hype was not a great one. It's not that someone should deserve to win or lose
Fair enough.
But I think it's a problem that Jane is talking to this group and giving a particular message, and then the other group is not able to respond. The people who are hearing that message are not really getting the other side.
But even from the perspective of the voters, not the perspective whether Jane is a good politician and therefore should win this context, but I would think that the steelworkers would like, and not just like in the sense emotionally pleased by it, but would actually find it valuable to hear what Jane Smith has to say about keeping the steel industry alive. And the farmers would like hearing what she has to say about that, and the PTA would like hearing what she has to say about education, and that actually their votes will be better informed than if she came out to each of them and gave a standard stump speech to all of them.
Yeah, so.
Oh, I was just going to break in. It's because I think we can to a certain degree cut through this, because if the challenge is around opacity,
Right. Just like
then there's a solution which has been implemented imperfectly, but which has been implemented, which is to publish ad libraries where the platforms have somewhere that you can go and see all of the advertising methods done by each political candidate. Now, does that cover third parties? Does it cover political action? I mean, there's problems with how it's done. But the transparency challenge, the opacity challenge can be resolved. I'm mindful of the time, but we don't actually need the full 15 minutes.
I'm sorry.
Okay, yes.
Yeah, I was gonna seek my time to do anything.
Okay, so number one, as an experimentalist, I just wanted to point out how many experimental or empirical assumptions, or I don't say assumptions, that sounds bad, but like estimates are intrinsic in the arguments you're making. And so it would be terrible if these turn out to be far from the reality, as we sometimes discover to be the case.
Sure.
And so as long as we are developing legal theories that are amenable to interventions from reality, I think that's really important. Because, for example, with the micro-targeting, thinking of sort of the panic about the Cambridge Analytica, I think that went away when everyone realized it didn't really work. But I think if it does really work, the discussion that you just had should be very different. And this is where, for example, we go back to the licensing idea. So I wonder, well, why do we not need to license this? And my personal view, and I mean, maybe it would run its first time in problems, but why do we not need to license commercial speech? Because it doesn't work that well, thank God. But what if it did? What if there was some ad I could run and everybody clicked on it, and everybody, for example, started giving lots of money? Well, we have some names for that. Like one of them is cults. What worries us about cults? Sometimes they are so convincing. Like if everyone sort of give them every time, not everyone, but like some people, maybe
But maybe 1/10 of 1% of the population.
but what if it will work? That's the worry, right? So maybe right now we're assuming that no speech is so powerful that it's like a drug where doctors prescribe drugs because they're powerful. But what if it turns out there are certain forms of speech or algorithm profiling that are that powerful? I think it's a hypothetical that should at least be factored in. If at some point there is speech or target that is so powerful that it is almost like a drug in its effects, that you can predict how it will affect some people, isn't that a point of concern?
Well, then we should it's certainly the case that the freedom of speech rests on the notion that people can resist speech. Just like sexual autonomy. Imagine there was a sexual practice that somehow did something to your brain that would make you go out there and start killing or start raping people. We'd probably ban that. I'm not at all a fan of banning sexual practices because, generally speaking, it's best I can know sexual practices, so long as they're consensual, are fun for the people involved and good in various other ways, and it should be up to them. But you're right, if somehow this fundamental quality of it were different, it would be different. But I mean, maybe I've just missed some news story, but I've just never heard of a situation where speech is so powerful that everybody goes out there and does bad things.
Genocide in Myanmar.
No,
Genocide in Myanmar.
But
That
in
they
fact,
directly linked to Facebook.
but that's a very different question. That's not about speech being so powerful that everybody is persuaded. It is about speech being so dangerous that even if a few people are persuaded. Another example is extremist Islam. It could be true of many extremist religions, just these days. Concerns about extremist Islam. Yes, everybody who engages in jihadi violence is doing that because at some point somebody spoke, right? Political violence always stems in some measure from some degree of political speech. Crimes of anger, crimes of lust, crimes of greed might be coming from normal human reactions, but crimes that are political, that are ideological, always come from that. But it's not, again, because the speech is somehow everybody is persuaded. It's just that it's dangerous, and that's the traditional concern about advocacy of violence, right? At what point does advocacy of communism become so dangerous that we're worried about, tens of millions of people being killed? At what point does advocacy of genocide become so dangerous? At what point does advocacy of just criminal misconduct become so dangerous? But I don't think you were talking about that. I don't think anybody's come up with some trigger thing that causes genocide, like genocidal thoughts or actions on the part of anything more than a tiny fraction of the audience, right?
I'm not asserting that. I'm asserting number one, we haven't pursued the possibility that that could happen.
Well, if it does happen, I totally agree. You should
Okay,
completely
number
rethink
two,
things.
micro-targeting, there's possibility, again, I'm not aware of like a really extreme case, but there's a possibility that some, maybe even a tiny portion, could be highly vulnerable at some point. And number three, what we are certainly discovering with social science is that repeated low stakes messaging certainly teaches us lots of things over time that can have profound impacts on people, right? Certainly we believe that about education, right? We're very concerned that children hear different messages because we know it matters in the long run.
Right.
So that's
If you have
also
repeated messages supporting
as
socialist
we have it,
revolution,
target.
then some people are going to want to engage in socialist revolution. This has
Right.
happened in countries that have been unfortunate enough to have socialist.
Or if Instagram or whatever tells teenage girls that they are all too fat and they hear it every day, it's possible that that is so powerful. By
Well,
some
right.
thresholds.
That would not change my view about free speech, because that has been the long-standing understanding about free speech. That in fact, many ideas are powerful enough that some fraction of the population will do bad things about it, generally criminal things, either revolutionary or just individual crime. That's been the concern about various supposedly gangster rap. There's been concern about obviously communist advocacy, about extremist religious advocacy and such. That I think current constitutional doctrine soundly says that that tendency, which is a real one, is not sufficient to strip speech.
I'm open to the possibility that that's founded on law.
As we all should be always open to the possibility.
It's always great to end on a strong point of disagreement. So I want to thank this was fascinating and a really interesting discussion, and I really enjoyed the different perspectives that we heard. So I want to thank all the panelists. Just as we wrap for the day, I want to give a very, very heartfelt thanks to Alexander Mata, our fantastic program. This year, coming back to in-person programming and trying to figure out how to do this again, putting together a hybrid event with flying people in and all of the logistics and organizing the online presence as well is a huge amount of work and challenge. So thanks very much for your excellent work there, as well as to the students who were helping you, who are no longer there, but you can thank you for me. Thanks very much to our partners with the Journal of Law and Technology. Again, also putting out a special issue is an enormous amount of work. We can all agree that law review editors do yeoman's work, and it's often thankless. So thank you very much. And likewise, this is just the start for the Institute for Technology, Law, and Policy. I've been in this position for one year today, actually. We're still a very new institute. We're still growing. So please stay tuned to our sign up for our mailing list if you haven't already. And stay tuned to our social media, YouTube, Twitter. I definitely want to end with a big endorsement of social media. And a quick plug that next week, we will be having a virtual panel on April 20th, once again featuring Eugene Volokh, as well on public access and anonymity. And he will be joined by Thomas Kadri of the University of Georgia and Amy Gaja of Tulane University, and it will be moderated by Mark Straight of UCLA ITLP. So that is April 20th at noon. I hope that some or all of you can join us for that. And again, thanks to all of you who tuned in both remotely and who, especially for those who've flown in to join us. This has been fantastic, and I look forward to continuing the conversation.